The sun rose slowly over the green hills of Virginia, casting long shadows over freshly tilled fields. It was July 4th, 1776, and though no one knew it yet, the world had just changed forever. In Philadelphia, a room full of men, tired, sweating in the summer heat, had voted to sever ties with the greatest empire the world had ever known. Some of them were farmers, others lawyers, merchants, philosophers, but all of them had signed their names to an idea that was bigger than themselves: freedom. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. As John Hancock pressed his bold signature onto the Declaration of Independence, he knew full well what he was doing. If they lost, it would mean death. If they won, it would mean something entirely new, a country unlike any other, a dream written in blood. But independence was not won with words alone. It was fought in frozen winters, where soldiers wrapped their feet in rags, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. It was fought in forests and fields, in small towns and great cities, where neighbors chose sides, brother against brother. The revolution wasn't a clean fight. George Washington, a man who had never commanded an army before, stood before ragged troops trying to keep them together against the mighty British redcoats. There were nights when even Washington must have wondered if the dream was too big, if the colonies were too weak. But through sheer determination and help from unlikely friends like France, America won. And when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the United States of America stood as a free and independent nation. Yet, if freedom had been won on paper, the real battle was just beginning. The experiment begins. Imagine for a moment 13 states, all wildly different. Some were bustling cities like Boston and New York. Others were quiet farming communities. They didn't agree on much, on religion, on government, on slavery, but they had to find a way to live together. That's when the Founding Fathers gathered again in 1787 to draft the Constitution, a framework for a nation that had never been tried before. James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, worried over every word. How could they give power to the people without letting the country fall apart? How could they create a president who was strong but not a king? In a hot room in Philadelphia, they argued and debated, and when it was done, Benjamin Franklin, old and frail, was asked what kind of government they had made. He answered, "A republic, if you can keep it. A nation divided and united." The early years were rough. George Washington became the first president, and he warned the people in his farewell address to avoid political parties, advice that was quickly ignored. By the time Thomas Jefferson and John Adams faced off in the election of 1800, the country was split. Adams, a Federalist, wanted a strong central government. Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, believed the states should hold power. The fight between them was bitter. Newspapers attacked each man viciously, accusing them of everything from treason to madness. Yet, when Jefferson won, something incredible happened. Power was transferred peacefully. No revolution, no bloodshed, just a new president taking the oath. It was proof that this American experiment might actually work. The West would call, but America was not content to stay along the Atlantic coast. In 1703, President Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase, buying a vast stretch of land from France. Overnight, the country doubled in size. To explore this new land, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on a daring journey. With a small group of men and the help of a Native American woman, Sacagawea, they crossed rivers and mountains, seeing landscapes no white man had seen before. They brought back maps, stories, and a vision of a nation stretching from sea to shining sea. Yet, westward expansion came with a dark side. As settlers pushed into new territories, they clashed with Native American tribes who had lived there for centuries. This was a story of progress for some and tragedy for others, a story that would haunt America for generations. Storm clouds gather. By 1812, America found itself at war again, this time with Britain. The War of 1812 tested the young nation's resolve. Washington, D.C. was burned, the Capitol and the White House set ablaze. But in battles like New Orleans, led by a young general named Andrew Jackson, Americans fought back fiercely. From this war came new symbols of American pride. Francis Scott Key, watching bombs burst over Fort McHenry, penned the words that would later become the Star-Spangled Banner. When the war ended, America had survived, and people began to believe in their country like never before. A new era dawns. By 1826, as America prepared to celebrate 50 years of independence, the nation stood at a crossroads. It was growing rapidly, its cities bustling with life, its frontiers pushing ever westward. And on July 4th, 1826, as fireworks burst in the sky, two of the Founding Fathers, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, died within hours hours of each other, exactly 50 years after they had signed the Declaration. Adams' last words were said to be, "Thomas Jefferson survives," but Jefferson had already passed. It was as if the first chapter of America's story had come to an end, leaving behind a young but determined country, flawed, struggling, yet full of hope. The celebrations of 1826 had barely faded when the seeds of division, long buried under the surface, began to break through. America was a land of dreamers and doers, but also a land where contradiction lived at its core. It was a country founded on freedom, and yet millions of men, women, and children were still enslaved. As America expanded westward, this question of slavery became impossible to ignore. The nation expands and splits. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, manifest destiny gripped the American imagination. The belief that the U.S. was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Pioneers, families, and fortune seekers loaded wagons and set out along the Oregon Trail, chasing a better life. Texas fought for independence and eventually joined the Union. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, brought vast new territories into the United States, including California and much of the Southwest. But with every new state added to the Union, one burning question remained. Would it be a free state or a slave state? In Washington, politicians tried to hold the country together with compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn an invisible line dividing free and slave territories. But as new lands were added, this line kept shifting and tempers kept rising. Voices of change and resistance outside of Congress, abolitionists, people fighting to end slavery, grew louder. Frederick Douglass, a former enslaved man, took to stages across the North, telling packed crowds about the brutal realities of slavery. His powerful speeches made people weep and made others angry. Harriet Tubman, risking her life, returned again and again to the South to lead enslaved people to freedom along the Underground Railroad. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that showed the human side of slavery. It shook the nation. Legend says when President Lincoln later met her, he said, "So you're the little lady who started this great war." The storm breaks, Civil War. By 1860, America stood on the edge. That year, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. A man of humble origins, Lincoln believed slavery should not spread to new territories. For many in the South, this was unacceptable. One by one, Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. They believed they had the right to break away, to keep their way of life, which was built on slavery. In April 1861, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. Brother against brother, the war tore the country apart in ways no one could have imagined. Young boys who had grown up together now faced each other across battlefields. Fathers sent their sons off to war, not knowing if they would return. Families were split, some supporting the Union, others the Confederacy. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 was the war's turning point. For 3 days, men fought and died on Pennsylvania's rolling hills. When the guns finally fell silent, more than 50,000 men lay dead or wounded. Later that year, Lincoln stood on that blood-soaked ground and gave a short speech just a few minutes long, but one of the most powerful in history. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Emancipation Proclamation. In the middle of the war, in 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate states were free. It didn't end slavery overnight, but it changed the meaning of the war. It wasn't just about preserving the Union anymore. It was about freedom. Black men, many of whom had escaped slavery, joined the Union Army. They fought bravely, knowing they were fighting for their own liberation. The end of the war and Lincoln's death. By 1865, after 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed, the South lay in ruins. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union was saved, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Over 600,000 Americans had died, more than in any other war in U.S. history. And just days after the war ended, tragedy struck. On April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer, while attending a play at Ford's Theater. As Lincoln lay dying, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." Reconstruction and new struggles. With Lincoln gone, the nation faced an uncertain future. Reconstruction was meant to rebuild the South and bring freed slaves into American life as equals, but it was a time of struggle and violence. New laws like the 13th Amendment ended slavery forever. The 14th and 15th Amendments gave Black Americans citizenship and the right to vote, but in the South, many white citizens resisted. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose, spreading terror to keep Black Americans Americans from voting or gaining power. The dream of a united and equal America was under attack, even as the country tried to heal. A nation transformed. By 1876, as America prepared to celebrate its 100th birthday, it was a different country than the one born in 1776. It had survived a civil war that could have destroyed it. It had ended slavery, though the fight for racial equality was far from over. New inventions, the telegraph, the railroad, the steam engine, were shrinking the vast nation, connecting east to west. Cities were growing. Immigrants were arriving by the millions, bringing with them dreams and hope for a better life. But beneath all the progress, deep wounds remained. Looking ahead, as fireworks lit up the skies in Philadelphia in 1876, people cheered for 100 years of independence. Yet, in the quiet moments, many wondered, could America truly live up to its founding promise that all men are created equal? The next 50 years would decide that, as America turned toward industrial might, waves of immigration, and a new role on the world stage. The fireworks of America's 100th birthday faded into the night sky, but a new fire was growing. The fire of industry, invention, and ambition. In 1876, America stood bruised but alive. The Civil War was over. Slavery was gone. But now, a new question echoed through the land. What kind of nation would America become? The rise of industry and the age of invention. The years that followed would see unimaginable transformation. The sound of hammers and steam engines echoed across cities. Steel mills burned bright through the night. Railroads crisscrossed the nation, tying the east to the west like never before. Men like Andrew Carnegie rose from poverty to build vast steel empires. John D. Rockefeller created a dynasty in oil. J.P. Morgan controlled banks that financed America's growth. These captains of industry, or robber barons, depending on who you ask, became the richest men in the world, shaping not just the economy, but politics itself. Meanwhile, Thomas Edison lit up the night with the electric bulb. Alexander Graham Bell connected voices across distances with the telephone. Inventions were no longer luxuries. They were changing daily life. But while wealth piled up for some, others toiled in dark factories and dangerous mines for pennies. Children worked alongside their parents, their hands blackened by soot. Cities swelled with workers, many of them immigrants chasing the American dream. The immigrant nation. From 1880 to 1920, more than 20 million immigrants poured into America. They came from Italy, Ireland, Poland, Russia, China, and beyond, sailing across oceans to reach Ellis Island in New York or Angel Island in California. With nothing but suitcases and hope, they crowded into cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, building railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers. They brought with them their languages, foods, and traditions, reshaping America forever. But it wasn't easy. Signs in shop windows read, "No Irish need apply," or "Jews not wanted." Chinese immigrants faced brutal discrimination, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first law to ban a specific group from entering the US. Still, they stayed, they endured, and in doing so, they became American. The fight for rights, women, and workers. As factories grew, workers began to rise up. They formed unions demanding better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Strikes broke out across the country, sometimes ending in victory, sometimes in violence. The Haymarket Riot of 1886 in Chicago saw workers clashing with police. Bombs exploded, blood ran in the streets. But even after the smoke cleared, the call for 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will refused to die. And women too raised their voices. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and later Alice Paul fought for the right to vote. They marched in the streets, gave fiery speeches, and faced arrest. Decades of struggle finally paid off in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. Failure is impossible, Susan B. Anthony had once said, and she was right. Race, segregation, and the Great Migration. For Black Americans, the end of slavery had not brought true freedom. In the South, Jim Crow laws enforced brutal segregation. Schools, trains, restaurants, even water fountains were divided by color. But Black Americans refused to be silenced. Leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois fought for education, dignity, and civil rights. Ida B. Wells exposed the horror of lynching through her courageous journalism. Meanwhile, millions of Black families began the Great Migration, moving from the South to northern cities in search of work and safety. They brought with them a rich culture, including jazz, blues, and a literary movement that would soon explode in places like Harlem. America on the world stage. The Spanish-American War. By the end of the 19th century, America was no longer just a country. It was becoming an empire. In 1898, after a mysterious explosion sank the USS Maine in Cuba, America America went to war with Spain. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months, but ended with a massive shift in power. America took control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and Cuba gained independence under American watch. Suddenly, America had stepped onto the world stage, a rising power that other nations had to reckon with. The Great War, World War I. In 1914, Europe erupted into war, a brutal, grinding conflict that dragged on for years. At first, America stayed out. President Woodrow Wilson urged neutrality, but by 1917, German submarine attacks and other pressures forced America to act. The US entered World War I, sending millions of soldiers, known as doughboys, to the trenches of France. The war was a nightmare of mud, gas, and endless artillery, but American troops helped turn the tide. By 1918, the war was over, though at the cost of millions of lives worldwide. Back home, Americans celebrated victory, but the world had changed forever. The Roaring Twenties, a new America. As the dust settled, America entered the Roaring Twenties, a decade of wild change. Cities boomed, jazz music filled the nightclubs. Women, known as flappers, danced in short skirts and bobbed hair, defying old traditions. The economy surged. Automobiles like Henry Ford's Model T rolled off assembly lines, putting the country on wheels. Radios connected people like never before. Families gathered around to listen to news, music, and stories. But beneath the glitter, not all was well. Prohibition, which banned alcohol starting in 1920, gave rise to gangsters like Al Capone, who made fortunes in illegal liquor. Racism and anti-immigrant hatred led to a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, now marching openly in cities across America. Yet, even with these struggles, America stood stronger and more powerful than ever before. Looking to the future, by 1926, on the country's 150th anniversary, America had become a giant, an industrial powerhouse, a cultural leader, and a global force. But as people danced to jazz in glittering ballrooms, few knew that a storm was coming. The Great Depression, which would test America again in ways no one imagined. Still, looking back over those 50 years, from the ashes of war to the heights of industry, one thing was clear. America had become more than an idea. It was now a nation, vast and complex, full of promise and pain, struggle and triumph. A nation still writing its story.